I'm often asked, where's the best place to get Japanese deck lists and results? Here's the best place. Sub. If you're new to this channel, welcome. My name is iKailaKai, and I've been working with Cross AI on articles for the past half a year to a year or so, and I have recently started doing my own YouTube to talk about the interesting things that are going on in Japan. Now, I made one of these videos 2 weeks ago exactly, and the meta has changed quite significantly since then, so I thought it'd maybe be a good time for me to make another one of these. I think making one of these weekly is a bit too much, as not much can happen in a single week, but making these bi-weekly is pretty good. So as such, I think I'll keep doing this. And if you're here to just know what's great right now, here's your answer. Doflamingo, good. This hasn't changed from 2 weeks ago, but many things have. So let's get straight into the video to see what they are. So to recap the state of the meta 2 weeks ago, Doflamingo was the best deck by far, and Purple Luffy was starting to rise up as a possibility. Decks such as Shanks were moving down a bit in priority, as Lucci was starting to be seen here and there, specifically in flagship battles, but not necessarily in unofficial tournaments. As such, let's pick up straight from where we left off. So rather than looking at the progression day by day until we reach the current point in time, I think it's better to just jump straight to the lists that are winning right now. And this is because obviously what was correct 1 week ago is no longer correct now. This Twitter user, OP09, makes these great graphics where he talks about flagship wins. He aggregates the results from every single flagship that he can possibly get to figure out which decks are winning the most in these tournaments. Now from this graphic we can see that the top 5 decks are Doflamingo, Lucci, Purple Luffy, and Red Shanks, but this is over the course of the entirety of September, and this would also include the period before I made my first video. As such, it's a pretty wide period, and there are remnants of this early meta as you see things like NL and Nami winning, probably more than you might expect to. Right now, there's a very hard chance for Nami and NL to win. One thing to note is that these are flagship battles. Now, flagship battles aren't necessarily to say that the level of play is weak. Actually, there are lots of high-level players, specifically in Tokyo. I'm not too sure about outside of Tokyo. I don't live outside of Tokyo. But in Tokyo, the average level of play is extremely high. So even at flagship tournaments, you will fight against people who are properly strong, and it won't feel like your average locals. Nonetheless, they are only 5 rounds, and there is an asterisk with that, because decks that tend to need to high roll to win, and struggle to win consistently over multiple rounds, like 9 or 13 rounds in a day, will end up winning disproportionately in these kinds of flagship tournaments and not unofficial tournaments. As such, that's why we see Lucci here. Now, Lucci has been winning here and there in unofficial tournaments, but still nowhere near as much as this graphic may imply that he's the second best deck. Now, in these videos, I try to aggregate my results only from unofficial tournaments and not these kinds of flagship battles, as of course flagship battles have lots of variance, and unofficial tournaments generally have higher level people competing because the pricing is better. The first Lucci list I'm going to be looking at is fairly standard. It runs Soap Sheep, and Soap Sheep has been run to deal with Doflamingo, because it's generally hard to get rid of Doflamingo's 4 cost plus 4 cost from Jinbe and whatever. And Soap Sheep, of course, with the leader effect, puts the opponent's 2 characters cleanly down to 2 and 1, which means you can KO it with Lucci. As such, Soap Sheep has been used in some Lucci lists to deal with Doflamingo, but the one issue is that it's only good against Doflamingo, and against other matchups it's not great, so not every Lucci list uses this. A card that many Lucci lists do use, however, is Kaku. Now, Kaku, of course, KOs a 3 cost or less, which means with your leader effect, KOs a 4 cost or less, which is enough to get rid of one of Doflamingo's characters very easily. As such, although it only gets rid of 1 character, it's very stable and consistent in getting rid of this 1 character, as the condition's very easy to meet. The reason why Lucci's popularity has come down a bit in general is due to the fact that he struggles to clear Doflamingo's board. Doflamingo, which was once an almost auto-win matchup when you hit it, is now relatively difficult. I wouldn't say it's winning or losing either way. I would need to test it a bit more. But I am surprised that Lucci players aren't running the 8 cost Sabo, because 8 cost Sabo, although it trashes 1 hand, is really good at clearing 2 things. This might just be my lack of understanding of the matchup, but this deck ended up running the 8 cost Sabo, and it seems to have done well. I am a bit surprised that it's only running 2 Jack, as the consistency of drawing is a bit low, but nonetheless the rest of the deck's fairly standard, just with these sorts of cards to focus more on the Doflamingo matchup. The second Lucci list, although the core is similar, is actually quite different in the way that it functions. Of course, it doesn't run the 8 cost Sabo, and instead runs the 9 cost Stussy. 9 cost Stussy, rather than targeting things like Doflamingo, targets the top end decks such as NL, Purple Luffy, Purple Luffy, Red Shanks, while sacrificing power, of course, to Doflamingo. This deck also runs the 5 cost Kaku and doesn't run Soap Sheep, but it does run the 2 cost Uta. Now, if you saw my video on 10 cards that are stronger now that Red Purple Law is banned, you saw that I talked about this 2 cost Uta. 2 cost Uta, of course, can't be hit by the opponent's leader, so if the opponent's board is permanently cleared, then it's basically NES lobby on the board that can permanently every single turn, minus 2 cost for free. Not everyone's using it, because if the opponent just has 1 thing on the board, then they can just hit it to take it out, And of course, as Doflamingo tends to spread out his board to a level that you eventually will fail to clear the board, the Uta won't always stick the same way that any Aslabi is guaranteed to permanently stick throughout the game. Now, if you may recall from my first video recapping the meta, Purple Luffy was on the rise as an answer to Doflamingo. And generally, the strength of this deck is that it can play Luffy and Sangoro basically one turn before it should be able to. If you're going first, of course, it can be played on the 5-tone turn, playing a 7-cost 8,000 and a 5-cost 6,000. And Sangoro being 5-cost is out of range of the opponent's 4-cost law, so it can't be bounced, forcing the opponent to have to clear it with events. However, as you've ramped, the opponent only has 6 stolen this turn, which means that they generally can't really use their events and also spread out their board, making it very difficult for Doflamingo. However, the Doflamingo lists have progressed a bit. Doflamingo's lists have started to become a lot more ironed out in this meta to deal with the surrounding meta, but it's still very up in the air what's the best way to deal with the mirror. As such, there's still very many tech cards that people are thinking about putting in, and this changes like basically every single day. I think less than half a week ago, people were putting in 6-cost Hancock into the list, and then now some people are trying 6-cost Jose and talking about that possibly that card could be stronger. Nonetheless, this is a very simple list that won a couple days ago that doesn't run any 6 costs. Now, the adaptation that Doflamingo players have made is, first of all, as I mentioned in my last video, they have been reducing or even taking out the 1-cost Pirona. Most lists don't run the 1-cost Pirona right now. This one does, but only as a 2-of. Now, as people remember from my last video, I'm pretty anti-1-cost Pirona, and this is due to the fact that it can really only be used on turn 1, and then after that it's a bit awkward to find a timing to play it, as it is more or less luxury. The adaptation that people have made is to use 2-cost Teach. Now, 2-cost Teach on the same turn, 3-dong turn when you're going first, lets you play whatever you want, although from your hand, straight to the board. This makes the same consistency as Pirona, as you effectively get to choose what you get to play. But not only this, on the 5-dong turn you get to play a 4-cost, and then use the Teach effect again to still use your leader effect. What people are doing with Doflamingo now is making an extremely aggressive build that doesn't run any sort of removal events, and focuses on just putting the opponent down to 0 as fast as possible and finishing the game with Perfume Fimiru. As such, I see why this set didn't run the 6 cost, and it's why I'm still a bit unsure about 6 costs in the deck in general, but this is a very standard list at the moment. It may end up changing in the future, but I think that it's very well-rounded and solid because it deals with most things in the meta just by pure power. Doflamingo gets to spread 2 to potentially 3 things every single turn, and if you use Teach, the hand cost is quite large, of course, as you're not playing the card out of your deck, but rather you're effectively playing it out of your hand. However, if the opponent just can't clear what you played off of your Teach or the other things that you played with your Teach, then that equates to more damage to the opponent's hand than your hand. As such, Doflamingo is transitioning from more of this mid-range aggro deck with lots of resources to just a straight aggro deck that doesn't really care about its resources, but recurs enough that it can have enough fuel to push through the game, even if it reaches 10 to a couple turns after 10 dong, thanks to cards such as Moria or Hancock that just let you effectively just permanently keep playing things for free. So what can you do about 2-cost Teach? That's the main question on people's minds in Japan, because that card is randomly absurdly strong in this current metagame due to the fact that there's very little removal. Well, of course, the best way to deal with it is to remove it. As such, Purple Luffy has now adapted to run the 4-cost Hitokiri Kamazo. Hitokiri Kamazo, of course, when you return a dong, KOs a 2-cost or less. And this not only deals with the 2-cost Teach, but also gets rid of Bonney's lower-cost blockers. 2-cost Teach and Bonney's low-cost blockers both are very difficult to deal with as Purple Luffy, and this adaptation has helped him stay a bit in the meta, but due to the fact that Doflamingo has found ways to deal with Purple Luffy, as well as Bonney coming more into the meta, has created for me personally a meta that I don't necessarily think Purple Luffy is strong. Purple Luffy's still winning a lot, and it's due to the fact that it just has simple, pure power and consistency. However, I think that the deck is starting to find more hard matchups as people are starting to tech for it. As such, Hitokiri Kamazo is a very good tech for Purple Luffy to try to survive these matchups. However, due to the fact that Purple Luffy's moves are very simple and predictable, although strong, it's kind of a scenario like Whitebeard, where you know what card's coming out, and if you do have the means to deal with it, then they're not a problem, and if you don't, then they are a problem. As there are much more cards in the game now compared to OP02 or OP03 where Whitebeard was a problem, there are ways for people to deal with Purple Luffy, and one of the options, of course, is Bonney. In my tier list video, I put Bonney in S tier, and a lot of people were surprised by that, especially in the Japanese community, but I'm happy to say that she is a top 3 deck right now. Currently, in terms of play rate in unofficial tournaments, it's basically Doflamingo, then Purple Luffy, and then Bonney. The reason for this is because Bonney currently beats the current versions of Doflamingo as well as Purple Luffy, putting her in a really great spot in this meta. The two cores that people are running for Bonney are generally the same. It's just a matter of, do you run 8 cost kit or not. I personally love 8 cost kit and think it's one of the best cards that's ever been printed, and also it just secures the win against many decks. One card that you may not have seen in a long time that you might feel a bit of nostalgia for is the 1 cost Veg. Now 1 cost Veg is coming back into the meta because of course there isn't as much removal, so people can get away with playing these 1 cost blockers. Bonney's down curve is a bit tight, but once you play Cavendish and you get 2 Dong active, of course you want to keep one of those for your leader, which means that you have 1 Dong left to play. Bitch. As such, these low-cost blockers have been finding their ways back into Bonney, and then cards such as Cavendish and Carrot that generally have a bit more difficulty being cleared in this meta are finding a lot of success. I think part of why people are saying that Bonney is winning to Doflamingo right now, one issue is that they can't really afford to run Red Rock, and I think that there are ways to deal with it, but two, importantly, many people aren't running the 4-cost Pudding. I think that if you are going into a meta where you even have a chance of seeing Bonney or you have a chance of seeing Black Yellow Luffy, you absolutely need to be playing 4-cost Pudding. And a lot of this is just Bonney catching Doflamingo players off guard and deck checking them. So we're just going to need to see how it'll end up balancing out, which side will end up finding the upper hand after teching, and how far they can go to make this matchup winning or losing. Nonetheless, Bonney has been on an extreme rise as it has a good matchup into these two, but it doesn't necessarily have a good matchup into everything, which is why I can't say for sure that she is tier 0. Of course, if you end up running these things like 8-cost Kid, you can't run things like 9-cost Shanks, and 9-cost Shanks is one of the ways that you're dealing with decks such as Shanks. Shanks has settled down, and many people agree that the control variant of Shanks is better than the aggro variant of Shanks. Shanks' hype has died down significantly in the last 2 weeks. You pretty much don't see Shanks anymore unless it's at locals, but I think that Shanks is actually good now. I know this is contrary to probably everything I've ever said about this leader, but in this specific meta right now, where there's lots of purple Luffy, Doflamingo, and Bonney, I think Shanks is good. Shanks has a decent matchup into purple Luffy, maybe slightly winning. He has a decent matchup into Bonney, assuming that they don't play 9-cost Shanks, which currently doesn't seem like she can because she needs to deal with the Doflamingo matchup. And then blue Doflamingo is losing, I will say this. However, I don't think that it's impossible. It's perhaps maybe 40% winning, which for this deck is enough if you can deal with the other 2 best decks in the meta. Now one deck that I'm on the lookout for, as I think he's on the rise, is Black Teach. Now Black Teach is a really confusing deck to me because I just can't make this deck work. I've tried and I just don't get it. When I win, I don't really understand why. When I lost, I don't really understand why. It's very hard to tell where you went wrong when you're playing this deck, and as such, it's hard for me to comment on exactly why the deck is winning. However, from people that I know who do play Teach have told me that it actually has a very good matchup into a lot of the top end decks. It's just that Doflamingo is a bit of a hard matchup. However, where I thought that this Doflamingo matchup was maybe 3-7 or 2-8, it turns out that it might just be 4-6, and that Teach can actually fight it quite well, especially if the opponent doesn't know how to fight against it. As such, of course, I will need to test this out a bit more, but I definitely do think that Teach has a lot of potential to come up in the meta, as many people are taking for granted that there is no removal in the game. I will say that Teach isn't necessarily a removal deck, but he does run things like Laboon and Dolkyu to deal with these smaller range things to slow down the pace of the game, to eventually close it out with his Jesus Vajeste and the 10-cost Teach. I would like to kind of explore the deck a bit more and try to learn it so that I can talk a bit better about it. Nonetheless, I do think that Teach is in a very good spot from what I've heard, as of course he can deny Luffy Taro from using his on-play effects, he can deny Shanks from using his Rayleighs, he can deny Bonney from using his 9-cost Shanks or 10-cost Doflamingos. Also 10-cost Teach can deactivate the effect of the 8-cost Kid. Teach has a lot of answers into the meta. The one answer that he doesn't have is against aggro. However, I see from unofficial tournaments that Teach is actually beating Doflamingo, not always, but occasionally, making it definitely not an auto-lose matchup. As such, I think that once people perfect this list and perfect how to play Teach, he could just be one of the best decks in the game, and for now, we can't tell. Rather than just saying, let's see how the meta shapes up, I would like to kind of try to predict. Now, I think that Doflamingo is still going to be the best deck in the game, and I think that Purple Luffy is going to drop down a bit. I think that Bonney is going to be relatively strong throughout until people start to find an answer for her, which could be tomorrow, it could be in 2 weeks, hard to tell when that'll end up being. And I think that decks like Teach as well as Shanks are going to start coming up a bit in priority. I think that Teach, even if he ends up being strong, won't necessarily be the most played deck, as the deck's just incredibly hard to play. So it'd be very interesting to see what'll happen if we have a very difficult deck as one of the strongest decks. And many top players are refusing to play Shanks as he kind of feels like One Piece with training wheels. As such, it's going to be hard to see if the play rate or even win rate of some of these decks is going to actually reflect the true power of the decks, as I still think that Vegapunk's extremely strong, but just no one's playing it. Actually, one of locals last week with Vegapunk, I don't generally post my locals results because locals aren't really a true indicator of actual skill or power of a deck. However, there aren't too many other tournaments going on right now, so we're doing with what we can. In the next couple of weeks, I'll be putting out videos occasionally where I play games with the best player in Japan statistically. This player is Tsukusagi, and he is the Japan Finals champion in 2023. He won with Green Uta, and people who were following my Patreon at the time will remember that I wrote an article on him, and that spiraled into me getting contact with him. So I think it'll be really cool to look at the sort of decks that he has in mind, his ideas and approaches to these kinds of leaders. And if you guys are interested in that, I will be putting those up very soon, so consider subscribing. There's lots of cool things that are coming, and we're just getting started. If you guys enjoyed this, I'm going to make another one the next 2 weeks, and I'll see you guys there. Bye bye.